There are only so many different facets of your own personality that you can get to, and you find yourself repeating yourself.
He finally let in a part of himself that he had kept hidden for decades when he was 83 years old. There were things he had never been afraid to say about himself that made him the perfect husband and a Hollywood star with calm blue eyes and a sharp sense of style. There were 6 loves, 6 men, and 6 stories of a secret life that had not been told until the end. He was sick with cancer and lying in bed in his Westport, Connecticut home in the summer of 2008. He asked the nurse in a quiet voice every afternoon to put an old Panasonic tape recorder next to him. He wasn't going to record a will or talk about the best parts of his famous job. Instead, he wanted to say what he had been feeling for a long time but never said out loud. Who did these names belong to? Why did Paul hide them until he was almost dead? Marlon Brando was the first name he gave me. It was a love story full of lust and pain. In 1961, they met for the first time at a hotel event to raise money. Paul showed up with his wife Joanne Woodward. As always, they looked stylish and well-groomed. On the other hand, Brando was late and wore a wrinkled shirt. He stood behind Paul the whole night and looked at him half jokingly and half cold. When it was finally his turn, Brando said, "I thought you'd be as boring as in the papers. As it turns out, you're the only one here who isn't lying." For the first time, Paul didn't say anything, even though he generally avoided compliments like that. Through casual coffee dates in Westwood, nights spent wandering around Silver Lake, and last-minute flights to Palm Springs, an unnamed friendship began to form. Paul loved deeply and honestly, like someone who was really feeling what they were feeling. However, Brando did not. For Brando, love and everything else could be apart. He never loved like most people do. Paul said in a recording from August 3, 2008, "He took me out of my familiar world and dropped me into rooms with people I didn't know, situations I didn't understand, and gazes I couldn't control." Brando took him to parties with directors, reporters, and producers, and there were always vague promises of movies, awards, and fame. The parties took place in private homes in Laurel Canyon or short-term apartments in Venice Beach. Paul thought at first that they were just parties, but over time he realized that he was just another character in Brando's plays that were written behind the scenes. He was a supporting character who was only kept around as long as it was useful for the media. Even worse, Brando gave picture journalist Mark Weller, who wrote news stories for the Los Angeles Mirror, Paul's private letters. The letters were soft, emotional, and trusting. The paper started an anonymous column called Love Behind the Lens in 1969. It was about a popular award-winning male actor who was torn between his family life and a secret relationship with a dark-haired movie star. It was Paul, everyone knew. Paul had no idea that Brando had dropped that letter off at the newspaper's front desk. Brando needed an incident to keep his name in the news, something that would bring up old photos and start new rumors about him. It was his way of making sure people would always talk about him. The price that Paul, who had loved, trusted, and kept quiet, paid for Brando's short life was his death. The pain was even worse when Paul's loving wife Joanne found a copy of that letter hidden in a bookcase by accident. She didn't say anything. She just wrote Paul a short note. "I'm still here if you need a safe place to go. I'm not the person who can help you with another lie, though." After that, Connecticut had a long, dark winter. Paul stayed home for weeks. Nell Newman, his daughter, says that in the middle of the night her father would often wake up, sneak out to the back porch, and smoke by himself in the bitter cold. Everyone knew, but no one asked. Paul said near the end of the recording, "I once thought that if I was patient enough, if I loved him long enough, I would make him change." His voice was heavy with tiredness. That said, Brando never changed. He only knew how to use every real feeling as a way to stay alive. Paul let that happen, even though he knew he didn't deserve it. Then he let out a sound that was almost like a sigh. "I loved him in a way that no one should love anyone." The story with Brando didn't end with a fight or a big goodbye. There was silence when Paul stopped writing letters and answering calls. He also stopped thinking that love could change people, but he never stopped being in pain. People who came into his life didn't always listen to him and leave. One person stayed, but not as a lover. Instead, they were a crazy storm of power and control. Someone who defended him in public and then did everything in his life behind that shield. Steve McQueen was that guy. When love is a fire, it burns both of them. Steve McQueen, what a jerk. Paul spat the words out as if he had been angry for years and crammed them into every sound. It wasn't just anger over something said or done. It was anger over a whole past that had been twisted, suffocated, and burned in a fury that was both dangerous and addicting. They met for the first time behind the scenes at the 1956 Photoplay Awards. Stephen was still a young, ambitious actor who had only had a few small parts on TV before becoming a father. Paul was already a father, but Steve's hostile, honest, and possessive look at him made it hard to look away. Soon short meetings turned into secret meetings that lasted hours at the Chateau Marmont Hotel. After the recording, Paul said, "At first I thought he loved me, but then I realized he just needed someone to show he could own even Newman." In 1962, Confidential magazine spread rumors that Steve McQueen was having an extremely close relationship with a male actor in New York. Steve responded quickly. Not more than a week later, he went to the opening of War Lover with Margaret. A non-disclosure deal written and given to Paul by Steve's own lawyer arrived at the same time. "You know what happens to people who get exposed, right?" Steve said in a low voice as he moved the paper across the table. "You have a family. You have a girl. Don't let your weakness cause everything to fall apart." It wasn't just stress, it was wiping out. Steve got rid of all evidence by using money, lawyers, and media contacts to his advantage. Paul once found a check from Steve to a Variety editor for more than $15,000. He didn't know why he sent the check. It was a secret payment to keep Newman's name out of an ongoing investigation. But the worst blow was still to come. During an interview on the M.V. Griffin Show in 1965, Steve was asked about a guy who was said to be crazy about him. He laughed indifferently. "I can't think of his name. Most likely an eager fan. They are the kind that comes to my door in the middle of the night with love notes. Quite creepy, in fact." Paul heard and got what was being said. Steve did more than just erase the past. He burned it and then put the ashes in other people's mouths. When they saw each other backstage during the 1973 Towering Blaze, Paul asked, "Why did you make me look like a crazy person to everyone?" Steve did nothing but smile, pull a cassette tape out of a drawer and throw it away. "I have proof to fight back if you ever say something bad." Steve had recorded every private talk, fight, and moment of weakness, keeping them all like weapons ready to be used if Paul ever turned on him. Andy and Steve got married that same year. Paul didn't say anything in public, but Steve got a package a few days later. The torn shirt he'd worn after getting drunk at Paul's house in Vermont was inside. There are still bloodstains, the strong smell of alcohol, and lipstick marks on the cloth. It wasn't a present, it was a message. Paul's voice broke on the tape. He cut with love. Every touch was a cut. Still, I kept going back. I loved him still. I was sure he would kill me if I let him get any closer. The next man to come into Paul's life was Robert Redford, who is the opposite of Steve. It was like fate wouldn't let him have a moment of peace. Soft, warm, and comforting like a sad song. But even that turned out badly. For millions of people in 1969, Robert Redford was the love that was broken. That was the year that Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid sparked a horse craze in Hollywood. The press said that the two men seemed like they were meant to be together on TV. Paul Newman had a lot of charm, was smart, and was quick on his feet. Sundance was played by Robert Redford, who was cool, smart, and dangerous. While shooting went on in Zion National Park, Utah, from early May until late May, another story slowly began to take shape. A love story that had nothing to do with the plot. They were still married in Connecticut, and Paul was 44 years old. He was only 32 years old, married to Lola Van Wagen, and had 3 young children. The two of them were both family men. They felt a strange, silent attraction to each other for a while. During cast meals, they would watch each other quietly, waiting for the next scene so they could stand next to each other, brush shoulders, or just look at each other for a few seconds too long. The crew stayed at a small motel in Springdale, Utah, on a weekend night. At midnight, a lighting worker named Dennis Corbin said he saw Paul standing on Redford's balcony with a cigarette in his hand. He didn't dare ask any questions, but soon Robert opened the door, pulled Paul inside, and the two of them were gone. It wasn't the first time. They lived separate lives from 1970 to the early 1980s. The world adored them as co-stars during the day, but at night they slept together as loves. One of them thought the friendship was real, though. Their choice was to keep it a secret. On July 14, 2008, Paul Newman admitted in a secret recording, "We both had wives, kids, and reputations, But I loved him with a kind of love that didn't fit into any mold. Thoughts. If I kept quiet for long enough and waited calmly enough, one day he would hold my hand in the light, the same way he did in the dark. That did not happen though. Stephen Close was a valued reporter from The New Yorker, who had talked to Paul in depth the previous year. In 1976, Paul planned to tell him the truth. They got together in New York City at the Algonquin Hotel. But just a few hours before the interview, Redford's rep called Paul on the phone. "You'll lose everything if you say anything about it." That same night, Close got a fax from someone who didn't give their name saying that Paul had mental health problems, abused prescription drugs, and had pushed a female helper while drunk. The interview was called off. Paul's work quickly slowed down after that, and no one could fully explain why. A few weeks later, a small Palm Springs newspaper called the Daily Star reported that an ex-co-star was avoiding an experienced actor because they saw signs of violence and mental instability in him. Even though names weren't written down, it was clear what they meant, and Robert, the close co-star Paul had helped, didn't say a word. "Do you still keep in touch with Paul?" a reporter asked Robert at the 1980 BAFTA Awards. His smile was weak and distant, and he said, "We made something great together, but now everyone has to move on." He turned around and walked away before anyone could ask him another question. Paul then went home, sat down at his desk, and wrote in his diary again. The writing was shaky. "They used to call me light, but now they use me as darkness to hide his face from the world." He didn't just say no, he hurt the most honest part of me, that part that no one would ever dare show without him. There was no fight or goodbye at the end of that love. At the end there was a deliberate silence that lasted until the lid of the coffin shut. One might think that Redford marked the worst of his pain. But no. Paul then said the name of someone who had made America cry when they were only 24 years old. An unhappy and rebellious person who left way too soon. James Dean was the friend and the brave knight in Mexico. The love that made the widest wound. Even though it wasn't the most shady affair, this one hurt him the most. A love that began with admiration, grew through a shared spirit beat, and ended in a heartbreak that he felt until the day he died. They met on a Warner Brothers set in the spring of 1955. The ground was cold. Paul was 30, and the lead in the movie Somebody Up There Likes Me. James, on the other hand, was only 24, and had just been named a rising star after East of Eden. People thought they would be enemies, but James didn't see any competition in Paul's eyes the first time he looked at him. Instead, he saw surprise and then a smile. Paul couldn't sleep for 3 nights in a row because of that smile. They started getting together more often. They would sometimes sit quietly in the corner of a cafe off Ventura Boulevard late at night. In James' brand new Porsche 550, they sometimes drove around without a plan. There was a wooden cabin in Ojai where they would spend the afternoons acting out lines from La Boheme. In reality, every word they said was an unsaid confession. After coming home from seeing Rebel Without a Cause, James told Paul, "I don't need anyone to understand me. I only want you to be real when you're with me." James' heart was beating fast, so Paul didn't say anything. He just took James's hand and put it over his chest. But beauty never stays the same. A paparazzi named Eddie Prescott took a picture of them kissing in June through the window of a parked car near Sunset Strip. Any newspaper would have been scared to run it, but within days, the Los Angeles Herald-Express's shadow lovers of the silver screen column made waves in Hollywood. Even though names weren't written down, everyone knew. James was quickly fired from a Warner Brothers marketing job, and Paul was fired from a project that director George Stevens was in charge of. The scariest blow came from inside the business. A producer sent Paul a fax that said, "Teach your wife to hold your hand in public if you don't want to drown like Montgomery Cliff." James fell apart. He stopped going near Paul. Letters and calls were not answered. Paul went to James's house one night and knocked on the door for hours. There was no one at the door. Someone had stuck a small note in the crack. It said, "I don't deserve to live if living in your eyes is wrong." The writing was very poor. 3 days later, James was in the hospital because he took too many sleeping pills. James Dean was saved from overdosing, but the cruel treatment he received from the press left lasting wounds. Paul Newman was pulled between his job, his marriage to Joanne Woodward, and a love that was falling apart. Paul had the plane ticket when James asked him to go to Mexico one last time, but he turned it down out of fear. James died in a car accident a few days later, and Paul will always feel guilty. After many years, Paul found peace and comfort in Salmano, who was a kind person who let him be himself. But Cess was killed before they could carry out their plans. Montgomery Cliff was another love story with sorrow and darkness. There were leaks of letters. Joanne left and the press sounded them. Paul's grief over Monty's death made him feel even more lost, and he had to deal with extreme anxiety and self-rejection in secret. Paul talked about these loves and regrets in his last records. He said he didn't want forgiveness, but rather that they wouldn't be forgotten. Thank you for reading this story. If you liked it, please share it and subscribe so you don't miss the next part.